Hello everyone, and thank you for choosing to spend your evening here with me. If you enjoy these stories, I'd truly appreciate your subscription, like, and comment. It only takes a second for you, but it means the world to me and helps make each video even better. Now, get comfortable and let's begin. The strange thing that you do and no other creature does. You are lying in the darkness now. Perhaps you cried a little earlier today. Perhaps it was a few weeks ago. Maybe you are one of those people who never cry or think they don't cry until suddenly it happens and catches you off guard. This lump in the throat, the heat behind the eyes. And then, if you allow it to happen, the tears come. They roll down your face. Vision blurs. Your breathing changes. You may sob or fall silent, but the tears continue to flow. This is one of the most human things you can do. And here is what's strange. As far as we know, you are the only creature on Earth that does this. Not just the only primate, not just the only mammal, but the only animal at all that cries emotional tears. Think about that for a second. Of all the thousands of traits we share with other animals, breathing, bleeding, hunting, playing, mourning, fighting, love, it is this one that seems to belong only to us. Dogs howl in distress. Elephants trumpet and gather around their dead. Whales sing songs of loss across entire oceans. But visible tears streaming down the face solely because of what you feel inside. As far as current data shows, this is a human invention. If you are settling into sleep, subscribe if you haven't already, and leave a comment. Tell me where you are and what time it is there now. I love reading them. Tokyo at dawn, Seattle at midnight, London at lunchtime. All of us here together thinking about tears in the dark. Scientists have been racking their brains over this for decades. Systematic surveys of veterinarians and zookeepers, people who spend their whole lives on animals in distress, have returned again and again with the same answer. There are no reliable observations of emotional crying. Not in dogs, not in cats, not in monkeys, not in elephants. Many animals produce tears. Every mammal, most birds, and even reptiles have tear glands. Crocodiles are known to cry while eating, which is where the expression crocodile tears comes from. But these tears are just lubrication, salt excretion. I care, and not emotion, not grief, not joy, and not shock. Human crying is different. It is not just tears. It is the work of the whole system at once. Your brain processes the emotion. Your breathing changes. That characteristic intermittent, sobbing pattern. Your face contorts in a way that other people instantly recognize. And your lacrimal glands, those little tear factories above your eyes, turn on and flood your face with liquid. All of this together, synchronously, noticeably, unmistakably. No other animal puts on such a complete performance. So why do we do it? This is a question we will follow throughout this entire journey. We will examine the biology of your tear glands and 3 completely different types of tears that your eyes produce. We will investigate whether animals really cry, breaking down viral videos, crocodile skulls, and some very intriguing recent hints regarding dogs and oxytocin. We will travel back in time to ancient Greek funeral rites, where crying was a sacred duty, and forward to neurobiology laboratories trying to figure out what actually happens in your brain when you break down. We will examine the chemistry of the tears themselves. Do they really remove stress hormones from your body, as some researchers claim? And why a good cry can leave you drained, and at the same time strangely peaceful. This is a story about what makes us human, and it starts with salt water rolling down your face in the dark. Right now, while you are listening to this, 3 types of tears. The liquid you never think about. Your eyes are covered with a thin film of liquid. You don't feel it. You probably haven't thought about it all day, but it's there, about 3 micrometers thick, constantly renewing, protecting your cornea from drying out, supplying nutrients, fighting bacteria. These are your basal tears, the maintenance staff working every second of every day to keep your eyes functioning. Your body produces about 12 microliters of this fluid every minute. It doesn't sound like much, but over a day enough fluid accumulates to fill a small shot glass, and all of this is distributed across your eyes in an incredibly complex 3-layer system. Right on the cornea is a mucin layer that holds everything in place. Then comes the aqueous layer, the bulk of the fluid, full of proteins and antimicrobial compounds, and on top, a thin lipid layer, essentially a microscopic oil film that prevents the whole structure from evaporating. This system is not unique to humans. Every mammal has it. Birds have it. Even reptiles produce something similar. Your dog's eyes are covered with practically the same tear film as yours right now. The same applies to the eyes of a sparrow, a crocodile, a whale. This is ancient technology, honed over hundreds of millions of years of evolution. The basal tear film is so effective at its job that nature has practically never bothered to change it. If you could examine it closely enough to compare your tears with the tears of a bird under a microscope, you would see strikingly similar structures. The same lipid layer, the same aqueous proteins, the same main task, to keep the eye clean and healthy. Then come the reflex tears. You are very closely acquainted with them, even if you never thought about what to call them. The flood that breaks out when you chop onions, the stinging rush when dust flies into the eye, watering in the cold wind. These tears are an emergency response. Something is irritating your cornea or conjunctiva. Sensory nerves send alarm signals through the trigeminal pathway, and your lacrimal glands go into overdrive mode. In a matter of seconds, you produce tears at a rate perhaps 10 or 20 times higher than normal, trying to wash away whatever is bothering you. Reflex tears are essentially the same basal tears, just at high volume. They consist of the same aqueous fluid, although the protein concentration may change slightly because you produce so much and so fast. The function is obvious. Something threatens the eye. Wash it out immediately. Any animal with tear glands is capable of this. It's simple defensive biology. An irritant appears, tears wash it away. The problem is solved. Evolution loves such elegant solutions. But there is a third kind, emotional tears. Psychogenic tears. Tears that have absolutely nothing to do with eye irritation or lubrication, and have everything to do with what is going on in your head. It is these tears that puzzle scientists because they do not fit into the general scheme. They are produced when your limbic system, the emotional centers of your brain, specifically the hypothalamus, activates the same lacrimal glands that produce basal and reflex tears. But the trigger is not physical. It is grief, joy, frustration, or overwhelming beauty. Physical pain, yes, but also emotional pain, the kind that doesn't touch your cornea at all. And this is where it gets really interesting. Recent studies suggest that emotional tears are not just the same fluid produced. For different reasons. They may be chemically distinct. A pilot study using modern proteomic analysis found 52 proteins, whose levels are significantly elevated in emotional tears compared to tears caused by physical stimulation. Many of them are related to immune function and defense. The tears you shed when your heart is broken may literally consist of different molecules than the tears you shed when you chop onions. This echoes the earlier work of biochemist William Frey in the 1980s. Frey collected tears from volunteers, emotional tears from people watching sad movies, and reflex tears from people exposed to onion vapors. He found that in emotional tears, the protein concentration was about 21% higher. They also contained elevated levels of prolactin, a hormone involved in care, and the formation of attachment, adrenocorticotropic hormone, which your body releases during stress, and leucine enkephalin, an opioid peptide associated with pain modulation. Frey suggested that emotional crying may be a way to literally remove stress chemicals from your body. That tears may be a detoxification of sorts. This was an exciting idea. But here's the catch. These results were not reliably reproduced. Later researchers, including crying specialist Advinger Holtz, note that we still don't have firm confirmation of Frey's specific hormonal claims. The biochemistry of emotional tears remains intriguing but preliminary. more of a mystery than a solved case. So, we are left with this puzzle. Basal tears have an obvious function. Reflex tears have an obvious function. But emotional tears, tears that blur your vision, increase your vulnerability, and happen exactly when you are already in trouble. What possible survival advantage can they provide? This question will accompany us throughout the rest of the journey. But first we need to ask something even more basic. Are we really the only ones who do this? Do animals really cry? Crocodile tears and the myth of crying beasts. Let's start with a story that medieval travelers loved to repeat. They said that a creature lurked in rivers and swamps, huge, ancient, completely ruthless, and when it catches its prey, when it drags the unfortunate victim into the water and begins to tear flesh from bone, it cries. Large tears flow down its scaly snout while it devours its meal. Mind you, not tears of remorse, just tears, mechanical, meaningless. The perfect symbol of false grief. The crocodile. By 1563, crocodile tears was established in the English language as a phrase meaning insincere sadness, hypocritical grief, the portrayal of emotion without its essence. The image was even older. Texts from late antiquity mention this. Medieval bestiaries illustrated it. But it was the 14th century travel narrative attributed to Sir John Mandeville that truly solidified this legend for European readers. Mandeville described crocodiles that kill men and eat them weeping, they yet and a wink. Preachers loved it. It was the perfect metaphor for false repentance, for a formal expression of grief when your heart remains cold. Shakespeare used it. In Othello, the hero warns against believing in a woman's tears because they are just crocodile tears, staged and meaningless. In Henry VI, this phrase appears again as a shorthand for feigned emotion. The crying predator became one of Europe's favorite moralizing images. But here's the thing. Crocodiles actually do cry. Not emotionally. Not because they feel bad about eating you. But they do produce visible tears. Especially during feeding. Modern studies confirm what those medieval travelers actually saw. When a crocodile climbs out onto land, when it opens its maw wide, when it begins the violent work of tearing and swallowing, trickles of liquid flow from its eyes. The mechanism is entirely physical. The jaw movements squeeze the tear glands. Air pushed through the sinuses during eating forces out the liquid. Tears lubricate the eyes, which are in the air, not in the water. In marine species, they help remove excess salt. This is maintenance and chemistry, not sadness. This tells us something important about how we interpret animal tears. Those medieval travelers saw what they expected to see. They knew that crocodiles killed without mercy. They saw tears. They assumed those tears must mean something, must signify some twisted awareness, or a hypocritical display of remorse. They built an entire moral system around a biological accident. We are still doing this, just in different directions. The truth is that tear production is universal among vertebrates. Mammals, birds, reptiles all have lacrimal glands or related structures that produce tear fluid. A 2020 study analyzed the tears of 65 species of birds and reptiles. Macaws, owls, hawks, caimans, sea turtles. Researchers compared them to human tears. What they found was both surprising and entirely predictable. The basic composition was strikingly similar. Water, salts, urea, proteins, comparable electrolyte concentrations. Under a microscope, the tears of birds, reptiles, and humans show the same three-layer structure. A mucus layer at the eye, an aqueous layer in the middle, and a lipid layer on top to prevent evaporation. Evolution does not reinvent the wheel. If a biological system works, it persists over millions of years and thousands of species. The tear film is an ancient technology. It keeps the eyes clean, fights infections, supplies nutrients, and protects delicate tissues. Every creature with eyes that are not constantly underwater needs something like it, so everyone has them. But there are differences. Caiman tears, for example, are incredibly stable. These animals can go long periods of time without blinking. Their tears are designed to stay in place. Sea turtle tears are thick, viscous, and saturated with mucus. They must withstand being washed away by salt water. The primary function is the same. Engineering details vary depending on the environment. None of this, however, tells us about emotions. These are maintenance tears, the animal equivalent of your basal tear film, constantly renewing, constantly protecting. The question is not whether animals produce tears. Obviously, they do. The question is whether they produce emotional tears. Tears triggered by feelings, not by irritation or eye health. And this is where it gets complicated. Because humans desperately want to believe that animals cry just like we do. You have seen the viral videos. An elephant in a sanctuary stands quietly, while liquid streams down its face. And the caption says she is crying for her lost calf. A dog reunites with its owner after weeks of separation, eyes moist. And everyone in the comments insists the animal is crying tears of joy. It is very compelling. It confirms what we want to believe, our emotional kinship with other species. But veterinarians and biologists will tell you that most of these crying eyes are not emotional tears at all. They are eye discharges, glandular secretions, allergies, infections, or blocked tear ducts causing overflow. Animals discharge liquid from their eyes for a dozen reasons that have nothing to do with feelings. When you see a dog with wet eyes, you are most likely seeing a medical problem or a normal cleaning function, not grief or joy. Starting in the 1980s, researchers began systematically surveying veterinarians, zookeepers, and animal care specialists. Do you see animals crying emotional tears? Do elephants cry in distress? Do monkeys secrete tears during grief? The answers were unanimous. Any hard evidence? None. These professionals spent decades in close contact with animals. They saw all kinds of emotional stress, separation, loss, pain, fear. The animals showed clear signs of this. Vocalizations, body language, changes in behavior, but emotional tears. The ones that overflow and stream down the face specifically because of feelings, and not because of irritation or illness. They did not see this. The scientific consensus, even now, is that as far as current data shows, humans are the only species that regularly produces emotional tears. That caveat, as far as current data shows, is important, because there are hints, suggestions, and complexities that we will return to. But the general pattern holds. You can examine the entire animal kingdom, from elephants to whales to our closest primate relatives, and you will not find another species that reliably cries emotional tears. This draws attention because we are hardwired for empathy. When we see an animal in distress, we don't just observe it, we feel it. Mirror neurons fire. We imagine ourselves in that creature's place. And when we see moisture in an animal's eyes, especially one we love, a pet or a creature with a face we know how to read, we see tears. We interpret those tears through our own experience. Of course the dog is crying, look at its eyes. Of course the elephant is sobbing, how can she not sob? This is anthropomorphism, projecting human qualities onto non-human entities. It isn't stupidity. It isn't ignorance. It is actually a complex cognitive ability, the skill to model another's consciousness, to imagine internal states. The problem is that imagination can outpace evidence. We are so good at seeing human emotions in animal behavior that sometimes we see them where they aren't, or when something real is happening. But it isn't at all what we think. The crocodile really does secrete tears while eating. Medieval travelers were not hallucinating, but they were wrong about what those tears meant. And we can make the same mistake, only in reverse. Instead of seeing feigned grief where there is only a mechanical function, we see real grief where there may be only clogged ducts or allergies. Both mistakes come from the same source. A deep human need to read emotions in the world around us, to find a reflection of our feelings in it, which makes this question even more interesting. If we really are the only ones who cry emotional tears, if it is a truly unique human trait, then why? What happened in our evolutionary history that made crying adaptive, useful, and worth preserving? The answer may lie in one animal that complicates everything in your dog, who is probably sleeping somewhere nearby right now, and whose tears might turn out to be not as simple as we thought. But what about dogs? An oxytocin hint that complicates everything in 2022. A group of researchers from Asabu University in Japan published a study that made headlines around the world. Dogs, they reported, produce significantly more tears when reunited with their owners after a long separation than when meeting people they know who are not their owners. And these were not just moist eyes. A measurably larger volume of tears was recorded on standard Schirmer tear test strips, paper strips, that veterinarians use to diagnose dry eye syndrome by pressing them against the lower eyelid to absorb and measure tear production. The lead researcher, Takefumi Kikasui, noticed that his own poodle's eyes became moist after she had puppies. This made him wonder, could positive emotions actually trigger tearing in dogs? So, his team designed an experiment. 18 pet dogs were separated from their owners for at least 5 hours, and then a meeting was arranged. The volume of tears was measured before and after. The results were clear. During the meeting with the owner, the volume of tears increased sharply. When the same dogs met a familiar person who was not the owner, there was no spike. Something about seeing their human again caused the dogs to produce more tears. But the study did not stop there. The researchers wanted to understand the mechanism. Why does reunion trigger tears? They suspected oxytocin, the so-called bonding hormone, a neurochemical that floods your brain during hugs, intimate moments, childbirth, and breastfeeding. The very hormone whose levels rise in both dogs and humans when they look into each other's eyes, creating a loop of mutual attachment that has made the human-dog relationship so successful. They applied an oxytocin solution directly to the dog's eyes. In one experiment, control drops. In another, oxytocin drops. Oxytocin increased tear production not by irritating the eye, but, apparently, by directly stimulating the tear glands. The hormone responsible for attachment triggered the secretion of tears. A pharmaceutical increase in tear volume reproduced what appeared to be happening naturally during an emotional reunion. Then came the cleverest part. The team showed 74 human participants photographs of dogs. The same dogs, but different shots. In some images, the dogs' eyes were moistened with artificial tears to make them look tearful. In others, the eyes were dry. Which dogs did people find more attractive? Which dogs triggered a greater desire to care for, to protect? The dogs with wet eyes won by an overwhelming margin. People wanted to care for them more. Visible tears, natural or artificial, worked as a social signal. They triggered a caregiving response in humans. Media coverage was massive. Headlines read, "Dogs cry tears of joy." Social networks exploded with videos where people showed their pets' watering eyes. Now with scientific confirmation. Finally, proof that dogs feel the same as we do. That those wet eyes at a meeting are the same as human emotional tears. The study seemed to blur the line between species, confirming what dog lovers had always believed. Our animals cry when they are happy to see us. Except the study didn't show quite that. Or rather, it showed something more interesting and ambiguous than this simple scenario. Yes, the volume of tears increases upon meeting. Yes, oxytocin can stimulate tear production. Yes, humans react to dogs with wet eyes. But an increase in tear volume is not the same thing as emotional crying. It is not the same thing as tears streaming down the face. It is not the same thing as the complex system of social signals that human emotional crying involves. Dog behavior expert Clive Wynne was quick to point out this distinction. The Schirmer strips used in the study are applied directly to the eye. They can slightly irritate the conjunctiva, potentially causing a reactive discharge of tears. The dogs knew the procedure was coming, as they had been tested before. Stress or anticipation could have played a role. Furthermore, the oxytocin drops themselves, regardless of hormonal effect, are still a liquid introduced into the eye, which naturally stimulates tear production to flush out a foreign substance. The study's findings were real, but their interpretation required caution. Clinical psychologist Lauren Bilsma, who studies crying in humans, expressed a similar thought. Humans don't just produce more tears when we cry emotionally, we produce tears that overflow, stream down, and are visible to others from a distance. We vocalize, we sob, we display an unmistakable facial expression. Our crying is a complex, integrated emotional and communicative manifestation. What the dogs showed was an increase in tear volume during an arousing, positive experience. This is interesting and truly novel, but it is not crying in the human sense. Nevertheless, this research is important because it hints at something biologists have suspected for a long time. The link between bonding hormones and tear production may be ancient, built into mammalian physiology at a deep level. Oxytocin receptors are present in abundance in the lacrimal glands of many mammalian species. The basic mechanism connecting emotions and tear secretion could have existed for millions of years, lurking in the genomes of countless creatures. Humans, perhaps, simply detailed it. We amplified it. We turned a subtle physiological reaction into a full-fledged communicative signal. Think of it as an exaptation. Evolution doesn't create new structures from nothing. It tinkers with what is already there, repurposing existing anatomy and chemistry for new functions. Birds didn't invent feathers for flight. Feathers first evolved for thermal insulation, were then adapted for display, and only later became surfaces for flight. It is possible the situation with emotional tears is similar. The hormonal link between attachment and tear secretion was already in place, shared by mammals. But in humans, for reasons we are still uncovering, this link was strengthened until the tears became visible. Overflowing became the norm, and crying became a social signal that others could see and respond to from across a forest clearing. In other words, the study on dogs may be showing us a glimpse of the raw material from which human emotional crying is built. It isn't proof that dogs cry like we do, but evidence that the physiological substrate, the basic hormonal pathway linking the emotion of attachment to the activity of the tear glands, is older than humanity. We didn't invent it, we intensified it. This is how science actually works. Not through dramatic upheavals where everything we thought before turns out to be a lie, but through gradual refinement through new data that complicates the picture, without necessarily refuting it. Yes, humans still seem to be the only species that cries emotional tears in the full communicative sense. But no, we do not function on the basis of a completely unique biology. The mechanisms we use have evolutionary predecessors, hints, and shadows in related species. The gap between us and other animals is real, it's just not as absolute as it seemed before 2022. And this means the question remains open, not solved, not closed. Intellectual honesty requires acknowledging that, as far as current data shows, emotional crying is unique to humans, but current data continues to change. The sample size in the dog study was small. The experiment has not yet been replicated. Other species have not been tested with the same rigor. We are still in the early stages of understanding the neurobiology of tears. Across the entire animal kingdom, what seems like a clear dividing line today may look blurred tomorrow. The frontier is still open. The answer is still being written. The helpless infant theory, where emotional crying might have begun if the hardware was already available, scattered across mammalian genomes like unused microchips. Then the real question is, why did our ancestors begin using it exactly the way we do? To trace this, we must go back not just a few thousand years, and not even to the Ice Age hunters and painted caves, but deeper into the night on the African savanna hundreds of thousands of years ago. When your species was not yet your species. Imagine a small group of hominids, perhaps 20-30 individuals, those very survivors of the bottleneck we spoke of earlier. But even further back in time, a ring of faint lights from a campfire in the darkness. Beyond it, tall grass, insects, the distant grunt of a large cat. The air is filled with scents, smoke, sweat, the blood of the day's hunt. Somewhere at the edge of the camp, an infant wakes up. Newborns then, as now, had almost no physical advantages. No fur, little muscle, no ability to cling to the mother's back as a chimpanzee infant can. Human infants are absurdly helpless by primate standards. Their heads are too large, their necks too weak, and their motor systems are not fully formed. They cannot walk, they cannot crawl, they can barely coordinate their own limbs. But they can cry. A baby's first action is not to crawl to safety, its action is to open its mouth and light up the night with sound. A thin, piercing wail, rhythmic, rising and falling, structured in a way that modern acoustic analysis shows is strikingly consistent across all cultures and even among different mammalian species. Mammal infants everywhere use sound as their first language. I am cold. I am hungry. I am in pain. I am alone. This is the part we share with other animals. Kittens mew. Wolf pups yelp. Baby monkeys shriek. Vocal crying is simply an acoustic distress signal. And it is ancient. It doesn't need culture. It doesn't need symbolic language. It needs lungs, a larynx, and a nervous system tuned to trigger them when something goes wrong. But somewhere in our lineage, something extra began to happen. Not at birth. Newborn humans usually cry with dry eyes. The tear glands are already working, moistening the cornea with basal tears. But there aren't enough of them to overflow. Those wet cheeks we think of when we imagine crying usually don't appear immediately. Modern pediatric sources point to the beginning of a visible flow of tears, somewhere between the age of 2 weeks and 2 months. There are variations, but the pattern is clear. First comes the voice. Only later does the visible water appear. Now imagine that same camp in the savannah a few weeks later. The infant has grown a bit older, its nervous system a bit more coordinated. The pathways between the limbic regions of the brain, the autonomic nerves, and the tear glands have become a bit more responsive. Something scares it. Maybe a sudden shout. Maybe the shadow of a hyena glimpsed beyond the fire. The baby's face contorts. Its breath hitches, and the wail soars again, loud and persistent. But this time, if you were close enough to see anything in the firelight, you might notice a new detail. Moisture wells up in the corners of the eyes. It doesn't just moisten, it pulls and then rolls down those plump, exposed cheeks. Here, the story enters the realm of speculation. We have no fossilized remains of tears. We cannot establish a date for the first crying child whose eyes visibly filled with tears, from sadness or fear. Instead, evolutionary theorists do the same thing we did with the bottleneck story. They take what we know now about infant development, hormones, and how humans react to tears, and rewind the tape. One idea that has gained popularity is simply called the helpless infant theory. It stems from an undeniable fact. Human babies are extraordinarily dependent for an extraordinarily long time, 9 months in the womb, and then years before they can feed themselves, defend themselves, or even move confidently. And unlike most great apes, where mothers do almost all the work, our ancestors apparently developed what anthropologists call cooperative breeding, shared childcare, alloparental care. In many traditional societies studied today, a baby may be carried, rocked, fed, and soothed by grandmothers, aunts, older siblings, or unrelated clan members. The mother is the central figure, but she is not alone. Such a system has enormous advantages. It allows mothers to gather food. It spreads risks if someone gets sick. But it also creates a problem if your survival depends not on one caregiver, but on a constantly changing network of people. How do you keep them all engaged? How do you attract the attention not just of your mother, but of anyone nearby when you are cold, hungry, or in danger? Sound carries far, but it is also crude. A scream in the night signals distress, but nothing more. It reaches your mother, but it also reaches predators and rival groups. It cuts through the grass whether someone is 2 meters away or 200. Useful, but primitive. A visible tear, by contrast, is local. It is a short-range signal. You must be close enough to see the glint on the cheek, the shimmering eye. You must be facing the infant. For a cooperatively breeding primate, that is extremely visual and reads faces for mood, attention, and intent. This extra layer of information could have mattered. Attachment theorists studying the bond between infants and caregivers have long emphasized that babies are not just bundles of needs, they are active social strategists. Their smiles, their eye contact, their cries, all of this shapes adult behavior. Perhaps, some researchers argue, the appearance of clearly visible, overflowing tears on an infant's face added a new tool to this arsenal, a kind of visual underlining beneath an already alarming sound. Modern experiments with adults indirectly confirm this. Show people a face that looks sad, and then digitally remove the tears. The emotion becomes ambiguous. Maybe the person is tired, maybe skeptical, or maybe just pensive. Put the tears back in and watch how the evaluation changes. Sadness becomes obvious. The sense of threat drops. The perceived need for help rises. People feel more inclined to help, to trust, to comfort. Take this laboratory finding back to the camp in the savannah. An infant whose eyes noticeably fill and overflow during distress can pull a bit harder on the strings of the nervous systems of those around them. Not just the mother, whose brain and body are already tuned to this child, but a teenage sister, an unrelated man, or a grandmother from a different lineage. Additional motivation to pick up, rock, feed, protect. The helpless infant theory suggests that this additional visual signal did not first appear in grieving adults at funerals or in lovers during arguments. It began with infants. Evolution added a bright, wet exclamation points to the existing acoustic cry. But why did such a signal remain honest? If tears are so good at eliciting care from others, wouldn't it be advantageous to fake them, to cry wolf, in a literal sense? This is where another idea comes in: costly signaling. For a signal to remain reliable over the course of evolution, its production must often be expensive or risky. A peacock's tail makes it more visible to predators. A roaring stag announces its presence to rivals precisely because these displays come with costs. They cannot be maintained by weak, low-quality individuals. They remain useful as indicators. Emotional tears may belong to this same family. When you cry hard enough that tears overflow, your vision blurs. The world at the edges becomes soft. It becomes harder to run, fight, or track threats. Your facial muscles relax. Your breathing becomes irregular. Your voice breaks into sobs. You look, in a word, unarmed. From the perspective of a hungry predator or an aggressive rival, this is not the best time to start a fight. From the perspective of someone trying to cheat who pretends to be in deep despair, while secretly preparing to attack, full-blown tears are not a good strategy. They undermine your ability to act within the deception. This is the essence of the honest signal hypothesis. Emotional tears may work in part because they are linked to a physiological cascade that is truly difficult to turn on and off at will, and that makes you slightly less capable in the moment. When your ancestors cried, they weren't just telling the group, "I'm in trouble" or "I am not a threat." Their nervous system forced them into this posture, at least for a short time, physically compelling them to lower their guard. Recent work even adds a chemical nuance. In one series of experiments, men who inhaled the scent of women's emotional tears without knowing what they were smelling showed a decrease in aggressive responses in laboratory tests. The chemicals in tears, at least in this context, appear to dampen hostility. If something similar works in infants, then a crying baby's tears could have performed a dual function, visually attracting help while simultaneously chemically softening the aggression of surrounding adults. Put it all together: hyper-helpless infants, cooperative breeding, a visual brain, costly signals that reduce threat, and you get a plausible path. First, the vocal cry as a universal mammalian alarm. Then, in our lineage, an amplification of the lacrimal gland's response to distress, especially in the first months of life, until visible overflowing became a normal part of an infant's intense crying. These wet cheeks, in turn, helped anchor and stabilize a caregiving style in which many adults, not just one, responded regularly. Once this system emerged, it didn't necessarily have to stay within the bounds of infancy. Human development is full of traits that start in children and are then adopted by adults. A high-pitched, Sing-song parenthesis speech that originally soothed infants becomes the basis for lullabies and ritual chants. Play behavior that trains a young brain in social rules grows into adult sports, theater, and games. Emotional tears could have followed the same path. A signal that first evolved to say, "Help. I am small and vulnerable and I need you," gradually extended into older childhood, adolescence, and adulthood, now carrying additional meanings, not just physical need, but social pain, remorse, reconciliation, or the nervous system that links strong emotion to the eyes in a 3-month-old child didn't suddenly shut off at puberty. It grew more complex, was restructured, and layered onto language and culture. By the time your later ancestors began burying their dead with grave goods, composing myths, and building complex alliances, the infant pattern of crying could have existed for millions of years. Every adult tear from this perspective would be an echo of that original cry. For help, the adult body momentarily borrows the body language of an infant to effectively say, "Right now I need you to treat me as a fragile being, to temper your aggression, to come closer instead of turning away." We cannot prove this story the way we can date a stone tool or sequence an ancient genome. But when you take the details, we do know the timing of development, cooperative child rearing, the social effects of visible tears, they fit together with almost frightening orderliness. And this leads us to the next mystery. If tears began as an infant SOS signal, how did they become something more ambitious? Not just a way to attract individual caregivers, but a way to hold entire communities together, to soften conflicts, restore trust, and stitch groups of strangers into moral worlds. For this, we need to move from the cradle to the campfire, from crying as a life hack for infant survival to crying as social glue for everyone. Tears as social glue. How crying bonded communities. Imagine the same campfire, but the child is no longer the center of the scene. 20 years have passed. The helpless infant has become a young adult. He knows how to walk, hunt, argue, fall in love. Now he has scars, memories, alliances, and grudges. The world of his emotions is no longer just hunger and cold, but betrayal, jealousy, pride, grief, relief. However, the system of tears remained the same as the one he was born with. Evolution rarely invents something from scratch. It reuses. It takes what already works for one task and nudges it toward another. So, if visible tears were already doing a good job of attracting caregivers to an infant, the next step in this story is simple but profound. What happens when the same signal appears on the face of someone who is no longer helpless? Imagine an argument in a small, tight-knit group. Food is scarce. Two hunters return with prey and argue over how to divide it. Voices rise. Hands clench into fists. In a group of 20 or 30 people, this isn't abstract politics. It's a matter of life or death, not just for the combatants, but for their children, their lovers, their aging parents. In most mammalian societies, such conflicts are resolved by dominance. The larger, stronger, or more aggressive individual wins, the other retreats, and the social order is restored around that fact. Displays of strength occur, growls, sometimes injuries. Reconciliation, when it happens, mostly comes down to physical proximity, grooming, play, or submissive postures. But our ancestors drifted toward a different type of society, one where hunting large animals required coordination, where knowledge of plants, tool skills, and memory meant as much as raw strength, where survival depended on the ability to keep the same few dozen people working together over many years, even after bitter quarrels. In such a world, you need something more than dominance. You need the restoration of relationships. Now imagine that the face of one of the disputants suddenly changes. The jaw relaxes. The eyes fill with moisture and glisten. Tears begin to pool and then drip. At that moment, all the mechanisms that once forced adults to rush to a crying infant turn on again. But now they are directed at a peer. The visual signal that said, "I am helpless. Take care of me," is repurposed to say, "I am overwhelmed. I am not attacking, I am asking you to stop. Modern experiments hint at how powerful this signal can be. When researchers show people photographs of faces and then digitally add or remove one detail, the glistening track of a tear on a cheek, everything changes. The same face without the tear might be perceived as irritated, detached, or simply tired. Add the tear and observers consistently rate the person as much sadder, much more in need of help, and much less threatening, even when the display is so brief that participants barely realize what they have seen. The tear speeds up their recognition of distress and increases their stated desire to comfort. The liquid itself does social work. Take this discovery from the lab back to the campfire. Inside a small group where everyone's survival depends on everyone else, a signal that transforms a rival's perception of you from an enemy into a wounded ally is of immense value. Early theorists put it bluntly. Emotional tears may have evolved as a display of appeasement because they blur vision, because they disrupt breathing, because they contort your face, making it soft and open. They honestly advertise that you are not in fighting shape. They say through muscle and moisture, I submit. I do not see clearly. I am not going to attack you. In small, interdependent groups, turning a potentially lethal fight into a tense reconciliation could have saved the lives, not only of two individuals, but of a hunting team, a childcare network, an entire fragile population. There is even a hint that the chemistry of tears might back up this message. In one study, men unknowingly inhaled samples of women's emotional tears. Afterward, in laboratory tasks designed to measure aggression and competitiveness, their responses were suppressed. Scans of their brains showed reduced activity in regions associated with anger. This is early work that requires replication, but it fits the overall picture. Tears can broadcast vulnerability visually, while at close range quietly nudging the nervous systems of those around them away from violence. If this is even partially true, then adult crying is not just a private excess of feeling, it is a social technology, and once you have it, you can do more than just stop fights. You can hold people together. Think about grief. In a world where infant mortality was high, where infections could take a person overnight, where a broken leg could be a death sentence, groups of hominids constantly face loss. A child dies. An experienced gather perishes in a fall. The group gathers, bodies leaning toward each other. Someone begins to make a low, mournful sound. Others join in. Eyes fill with moisture. Tears fall outward. This scene is heartbreaking from an evolutionary point of view, but it is also functional. When modern participants in experiments read stories or watch videos of someone who is crying, compared to someone who is trying their best not to cry, they report feeling a greater social connection to the crier, a greater willingness to sit nearby, offer help, or forgive an old grudge. Analysis of these studies points to a key mechanism. Tears enhance the perception of helplessness and shared emotion, which in turn increases pro-social responses. In small ancestral groups, this feedback loop could bond people tighter every time they faced a collective blow. Public tears became a way of saying, I am with you in this. Your loss is my loss. Our world has changed, but the group is still here. They transform the private pain inside someone's skull into something visible that others can mirror and respond to. The same system could work in more joyful directions as well. Tears of joy are harder to explain if you view crying only as a leakage of suffering. But if you see tears as a signal that says, this emotion is overwhelming, and I want you to feel it with me, then everything makes sense. The relief when a hunter returns alive from a dangerous journey, or at the sight of a meteor shower, or at the birth of a child after many failed pregnancies. In these moments, the body sends the same old infant message, flooded, overwhelmed. Please come closer. But now, the content of that overload might be gratitude, wonder, or triumph. Tears turn internal peaks and valleys into something the group can see and join. They synchronize feelings. One person's eyes begin to glisten, then a few more, then many. Soon, you no longer have just individual joy, but a collective ecstasy tied to a shared memory. This is what some researchers mean when they speak of tears as social glue. They help coordinate emotional states within a group. They make it easier for people to understand what others are going through, not just by the shape of a frown or a smile, but by the added emphasis of moisture. In controlled experiments, a neutral face with tears is rated as almost as sad as a classically sad face without tears. In real life, this means that subtle, ambiguous states, quiet desperation, muffled shame can still be clearly registered by those around. Hidden pain becomes harder to ignore. For a species that relies increasingly on cooperation, on sharing food, childcare, and knowledge, such transparency is worth its weight in gold. It allows problems to surface earlier. It allows apologies to strike deeper. It allows gratitude and admiration to spread, rather than remaining locked inside a single person. And all of this unfolded alongside other channels of communication. Our ancestors were not just silent, weeping statues. They had postures, slumped shoulders, open palms, bowed heads. They had facial expressions, the triangular sad mouth, the knit brows of confusion, the wide eyes of fear. They had vocal tones, a tremor in the voice, a sudden shift to a whisper, a transition to a scream. Eventually, they had words. Language, when it reached its full complexity, did not replace these old systems. It layered on top of them. A human could now say, "I'm sorry. I'm scared. I'm so glad you're alive." But tears gave these words weight. An apology with tears in the eyes and an apology with dry eyes do not feel the same even today. A storyteller whose eyes glisten while describing the heroic death of an ancestor draws the audience in more powerfully than one whose face remains immobile. From this perspective, emotional tears look not like a strange glitch in human design, but like one of the strands in a braided rope. Facial expressions, body language, tone of voice, and, later, speech. Everything is interwoven, everything honed by the same factors. Tiny groups trying to maintain coordination, heal rifts, share knowledge, and survive. As far as current data shows, no other animal has gone so far in using the channel of ocular moisture. Many species use postures, sounds, and even scents to signal distress or submission. We, it seems, are the only ones who turned a transparent liquid on the face into a multi-tool of social life, a way for infants to hook caregivers, for rivals to back down without losing everything, for mourners to rally the community, for joy to overflow into something shared. Of course, in the modern world, the effect of tears is not always beneficial. Context and culture matter. A crying child in one society might be comforted, while in another, shouted at to be quiet. A crying man in one company might be seen as honest, and in another, as weak. But beneath these shifting norms lies a more ancient, deeper neural network. Millions of years of brain work that, on average, perceives wet eyes as a signal to come closer, rather than move away. From here, the story turns inward again. If tears help shape the behavior of those around us, what do they do inside our own bodies when they arrive? Why does a good cry sometimes leave us calmer and lighter, as if something heavy has been washed away? To answer this, we need to move from the campfire into the bloodstream and trace what happens on a chemical level. When emotion turns into water, by the time tears actually reach your cheeks, the story is already in full swing. It begins deep in the skull, in a set of structures, sometimes called the emotional brain, the limbic system. Something happens, not always something grand. A memory surfaces, a phrase touches a nerve, a musical theme reaches that exact passage played at a funeral years ago. Or, quite simply, the accumulated fatigue of the day, petty humiliations, and unspoken anxieties finally break an invisible balance. The amygdala is one of the first areas to flare up. It is often called the brain's alarm system. But it's not just a panic button. It is a significance detector. Is this important? Is this dangerous? Does this mean something to me? When the answer is yes, the amygdala passes the information to the hypothalamus, a tiny but powerful region that sits like a command center between emotions and the body. The hypothalamus is wired to your autonomic nervous system, the network that quietly manages heart rate, breathing, blood pressure, sweating, and digestion. It can switch you into fight or flight mode, or return you to a state of rest and digest. In emotional crying, as far as current data shows, it tends to do both. First, there is a surge. The heart rate increases. Breathing becomes shallow or hitches. Muscles tense. Sympathetic nerves, those that prepare you for action, running, or screaming, become active. Laboratory studies that have captured genuine stress-induced crying show clear signs of this arousal phase. Elevated pulse. Spikes in sympathetic nervous system activity sharper than during ordinary mental exertion. At first glance, this looks like the start of a fight or flight response rather than a gentle relaxation. But then something strange happens. Instead of directing this activation toward fighting or fleeing, the system in many people performs a U-turn. The same hypothalamus that helped rev everything up begins to engage its antagonist, the parasympathetic system, the branch that slows the heart, deepens breathing, and nudges the body toward recovery. Breathing begins to move in those ragged, sighing waves you know from your own crying. A long exhale, a stuttering inhale, and ultimately a deep, shaky sigh. After a few minutes, the heart rate usually drops. Blood pressure falls. Where the sympathetic system was hitting the gas, the parasympathetic gently taps the brakes. If the early phase of crying is a storm front, then the late phase is the clearing sky. Researchers sometimes describe this as a shift from sympathetic dominance to parasympathetic rebound. The idea is that crying may be one way the body helps itself exit a state of unbearable, prolonged arousal. Tears are not separate from this process, they are built into it. While all this is happening in your chest and stomach, another line of communication stretches from the hypothalamus down to your eyes. Your lacrimal glands live in the upper outer corners of your eye sockets. They are controlled by cranial nerves, bundles of fibers that go straight from the brainstem to the face. Fall reflex tears, those secreted when smoke or onion vapors hit the eyes. The primary pathway goes bottom up. Sensory fibers from the irritated eye transmit a signal via the trigeminal nerve back to the brainstem, where they trigger a reflex arc that activates parasympathetic fibers of the facial nerve. These fibers command the lacrimal gland to begin secretion. Emotional tears use a similar final pathway, but the command begins higher up. Limbic and cortical areas, the amygdala, parts of the medial prefrontal cortex, send signals down to the same autonomic nuclei in the brainstem. Instead of the message "Pepper got in my eye," the message is more abstract. This situation is causing pain. Run the crying program. From there, the order is transmitted by parasympathetic branches of the facial nerve to the lacrimal glands, which begin producing a liquid that differs in composition from the one used for ordinary moistening. And this is where the chemistry becomes truly interesting and shaky. In the 1980s, biochemist William Frey collected people's tears in small vials. Some were reflex, caused by irritants. Others were emotional, caused by sadness or stress. In his analysis, he reported a number of differences. Emotional tears, he said, contained higher levels of certain proteins, prolactin, a hormone associated with caregiving and stress, adrenocorticotropic hormone ACTH, which is involved in the body's stress response, and a small peptide called leucine enkephalin, an endorphin-like substance, associated with pain modulation. Based on these findings, a story emerged that quickly permeated popular culture. People began saying that crying literally washes out stress hormones from your body. Emotional tears are a kind of biochemical detox, a way of removing excess cortisol and ACTH, so that their internal levels can return to normal. The result, with leucine enkephalin, added a poetic touch. Perhaps tears don't just remove the chemistry of stress, but also deliver their own homegrown anesthetic. Your tears flow, and somewhere your pain receives a chemical buffer. It is a very attractive picture. It matches the folk notion that a good cry washes something out. It feels right. But when later researchers tried to find reliable, repeatable evidence, the story grew more complicated. Advinger Holtz, one of the leading scientists in the field of crying research, and his colleagues spent years testing these claims. They do not deny that emotional and reflex tears may differ in composition. There are hints of higher protein and hormone content, but they point to a simple quantitative problem. Even if emotional tears do contain stress-related substances, the total volume of tears you produce during an average crying episode is negligible compared to the volume of blood and extracellular fluid in your body. The amount of ACTH or other hormones that could be excreted through crying is, from this perspective, likely too small to meaningfully change your overall hormonal profile. From this standpoint, crying as a detox mechanism doesn't add up. The numbers do not support a large-scale cleansing effect. The finding of leucine enkephalin faces similar caveats. It is tempting to think of an endorphin-like peptide exiting your eyes and hinting at pain relief, but replication results have been mixed. Modern methods do not consistently confirm large differences, and if this peptide is there, it may be a trace marker of the body's general stress state rather than a sign that the tears themselves function as a painkiller. So what remains of the idea of a good cry? If it's not about flushing out chemicals, then what happens when you sob in the dark and later feel, if not happy, then at least a bit softer inside? Some clues lead us back to the dynamics of the nervous system. We just traced the path from a sympathetic surge to a parasympathetic rebound. The transition from a racing heart and a constricted throat to long exhales and a slowed pulse is very similar to what your body does after other intense states. For example, after a hard sprint or a panic attack that has peaked and begun to subside. Crying may serve as one of the pathways for this transition. It is a kind of embodied punctuation mark. Something monumental has happened inside, and now the system is moving toward recovery. But when psychologists ask people about recent crying episodes, another pattern emerges. People do not always feel better after crying in every context. They tend to feel better when certain social conditions are met. If you cry and someone you trust responds with warmth, stays with you, listens without shaming, and offers touch or silent understanding, indicators of relief and catharsis skyrocket. People describe it as a feeling of cleansing, lightness, and closeness to the person who witnessed their tears. If you cry alone and remain alone, or cry in a setting where you feel judged, trapped, or embarrassed, the consequences are different. Many say they feel worse, more drained, shamed, and exhausted without the compensating comfort. In laboratory settings, where participants know they are being watched and often feel inhibited, crying episodes particularly rarely lead to an improvement in mood. The context is too artificial, too exposed. From an evolutionary perspective, this makes sense. If emotional tears evolved, at least in part, as social signals as a way to attract others, temper aggression, and elicit care, then their full effect depends on the completion of this cycle. The chemistry inside your body is important, but so is the reaction from the outside. When tears draw in a soothing presence, everything falls into place. The parasympathetic system is activated. Stress hormones may gradually decrease for other reasons. And now there is a hand on your shoulder, and a voice says, "I'm here." The nervous system doesn't just calm down in isolation, it co-regulates with another person. When no one comes, or when the reaction is harsh, the signal has been sent, but the expected feedback is absent or negative. The body has executed the crying program, but the social world has not provided the reciprocal care. Relief is much harder to find. Thus, the chemistry of a good cry, as far as we understand it, is a mixture of three intertwined strands. There is the neurobiology, limbic alarm, hypothalamic commands, cranial nerves forcing the lacrimal glands to pour out moisture, and autonomic systems shifting from arousal to rest. There is the liquid itself, a salty cocktail with proteins and hormones and, perhaps, trace amounts of endorphin-like molecules, different enough from reflex tears to invite interest, but not yet different enough to definitively prove a detox or anesthesia function. And there is the social layer, the way tears, once visible, invite or do not invite comfort from those around us, and how that response affects heart rate, breathing, and mood. Ultimately, The mystery of why you sometimes feel much better after crying may lie not so much in the drops on your cheeks as in the larger pattern of which they are a part. The body shifting gears, and the primate brain, albeit silently, reaching out to others for support. Our ancestors, huddling in animal skins and staring at dying embers, felt these shifts without having words for the limbic system or ACT. They only knew that, after a storm of sobbing, a calm often settles in the chest, and that tears shared with others can turn unbearable pain into something communal. Over time, humans would take this private bodily storm and build rituals, songs, and stories around it, formal ways to cry together. To see how far this went, we need to leave the skull and return to the long arc of culture, where tears became a sacred tool in the oldest ceremonies of mourning and memory. Ancient laments. Tears as sacred ritual in the early world. Imagine that the campfire light has changed. We are no longer in a small group on the Pleistocene savanna. The flame is higher now, licking at felled logs. Around it rise walls of sun-dried brick, stone houses, city gates. Grain is stored in jars. Kings carve their names in clay. And when someone dies, tears have an audience. Imagine a street in a Bronze Age city, say in Mesopotamia, somewhere along the Euphrates. The air is hot and thick with dust from the chaff of threshing floors. A small procession moves slowly between houses. In the center, on a wooden litter, lies the body of a man who was important to this quarter. A merchant, a scribe, or a warrior. Around him, one hears not quiet sobs, but an organized noise. The women in front begin a high, vibrating cry that soars and falls like a siren. This is not accidental. This sound has a shape, a pattern they all know. One voice calls out lines about the deceased, about his children, his craft, the gods who protected him, while the others respond with a repetitive phrase. Between verses, they beat their chests, tear their hair, and dig their fingers into their cheeks so hard that marks remain. The men follow behind. They are less demonstrative, but they do not remain dried. Some cover their faces with cloaks, others let their tears flow freely. At certain key refrains, they join in, adding a low, rough chant beneath the sharp female wailing. This is not just an outlet for grief, it is a performance of grief. By the time the procession reaches the burial site, the lament has accomplished several tasks at once. It tells the story of the deceased, it announces the loss to the entire neighborhood. Summoning witnesses, it gives everyone present, even those who barely knew the person, a script for what they should feel. And, importantly, it signals to the gods, we are paying attention. We are keeping count of those who have gone. When we move slightly westward in space and time to archaic Greece, the pattern becomes even clearer. Greek funerals, judging by surviving texts and images, were built around formal lamentations. Different parts of the ritual had their own names. Goose, the wild wailing raised by relatives at the bedside and around the litter. Thermos, a more structured funeral song that could be performed by specialists, almost professional mourners. Vase painting of the geometric period, those early angular figures scratched onto clay, already shows the key elements. The body laid out on a platform, women standing with hands raised to their heads, long fingers pull and tear at hair, sometimes shown ripping out strands. Other figures are shown with uplifted arms, bared breasts, and torn clothing. Later written sources add sensory details, rhythmic beating of the chest, scratching of cheeks with fingernails, rending of garments, the sound of piercing, warbling cries transitioning into a chanting praise of the deceased. The voice is alternate. One woman leads, others respond. Sometimes men insert brief phrases of praise or sorrow. For Greek women, crying was not just permitted, it was expected. It was a social role passed down through practice and memory. If a relative died and you did not wail, sob, and tear your hair, you were not just going against your heart, you were failing in your duty to the dead. Crying in this world became a kind of sacred labor, and, like any powerful labor, it had to be managed. It is one thing to have emotional tears in a tight family circle, and quite another to have those same tears amplified to the scale of a collective ritual. Dozens of people sobbing, screaming, and shaking their bodies in unison on a corpse is something entirely different. Athenian lawmakers seem to have noticed this. In the 6th century BCE, the reformer Solon attempted to regulate the rites. Surviving fragments indicate very practical concerns. A ban on scratching cheeks until they bled, a ban on wandering from tomb to tomb, and a ban on professional mourners ramping up grief. For the sake of the intensity of the process itself, restrictions were introduced on who could attend, how long they could stay, and how much noise they could make. Behind this, many historians see a deeper anxiety. Women's laments, with their primal physicality and publicity, were one of the few sanctioned ways in which those who lacked formal political power, wives, mothers, sisters, could criticize, remember, and sometimes indirectly accuse. A lament for a son killed in war could turn, almost imperceptibly, into a commentary on the decisions of generals. A lament for a man executed by the state could contrast his honor with the shame of those who condemned him. Collective grief, in other words, could carry a political charge. Solon's laws tell us that the city valued tears enough to preserve them. Funerals remained loud and full of sobbing, but also feared what would happen if this crying remained uncontrolled. An excess of lamentation could disturb not only the peace of the tomb, but the peace of the polis. At the same time, a strict gender grammar existed in all of this. In many early societies, including Greece and the cultures of the ancient Near East, the duty of public, loud, and prolonged crying fell primarily upon women. It was they who were trained in poetic formulas. It was their bodies that embodied the visible signs: torn hair, scratched cheeks, bared breasts that signaled grief to the community and the gods. Male tears, by contrast, had their own narrow corridors. When a man wept openly, it had to mean that something exceptional had occurred. Myths and scriptures are full of such sanctioned moments. Achilles, the fiercest of Greek warriors, collapses over the body of Patroclus. He sobs, he clings to the corpse, he covers himself in ash. His tears do not make him weak, they make his loss and his love undeniable. They mark the turning point that will force him back into battle. In another tradition, the Hebrew Bible tells of King David mourning his rebellious son Absalom. "O my son Absalom, my son Absalom." The text emphasizes that he covers his face and weeps as he walks. A king, temporarily stripped of monarchical equanimity by paternal grief. His tears do not undermine his power, they underscore his humanity. These are not everyday tears. They are, in their own way, theatrical, tied to heroism, sacrifice, or unbearable family loss. Thus, we see a forming pattern. Women are permitted, and even duty-bound, to weep loudly, and frequently in specific ritual contexts. Men, however, are expected to show restraint in most situations, but are allowed an explosive, emotionally charged cry when the narrative stakes are high enough. The fact that these models had to be reinforced by laws, stories, and art suggests another thought. Everyone, regardless of gender, was capable of crying. Emotional tears were not rare. What was rare, and therefore an interesting plot point, was a man crying. Outside of these ritual boundaries, even the physical traces of ancient mourning hint at how people regarded the tears themselves, not just the act of shedding them. In Hellenistic and Roman burials, archaeologists often find small glass or ceramic vessels with narrow necks, sometimes spindle-shaped, sometimes with elegant long rims. For a long time, they were called lacrimaria, tear catchers. Legend had it that mourners literally collected their tears in these vials, preserving them as an offering to the deceased or as proof of their grief. A widow might show a bottle of tears to her soldier husband as evidence of her fidelity. The more full vessels in a tomb, the stronger the love. Modern science has called toward this literal interpretation. Chemical residues in most of these vessels point to oils and perfumes rather than salty tears. As far as specialists can tell, there is not a single ancient text that explicitly describes people bottling their sobs. And yet, the persistence of the idea of tear catchers in late Roman anecdotes, medieval sermons, and modern religious art speaks for itself. People believed that tears were something that could be measured and collected, something worthy of being kept, counted, and offered. One biblical psalm even uses the metaphor of a deity keeping a person's tears in a bottle, as if every drop of sorrow were recorded somewhere beyond human sight. This metaphor only works if you already live in a world where tears are perceived as valuable substances, not just wastewater, but physical signs of love, loyalty, and pain. Thus, by the time cities grew and laws were codified, that quiet cycle of the nervous system you feel during a modern crying fit was already wrapped in layers of meaning. Tears were signals to kin, to the wider community, to gods or spirits. They were obligations, part of what you owed the dead, your family, and your social role. They were a potential threat, capable in large quantities and in the right mouths of sowing unrest or questioning authority. And they were already political tools, assigned to some bodies more than others, permitted in some contexts and forbidden in others, constantly debated at the boundary between private and public order. From the times of the earliest literate civilizations, people treated emotional tears as something much greater than a side effect of a stressed brain. They treated them as raw material for ritual, law, and story. Which brings us back to the great mystery. If a few milliliters of salty liquid can be turned into a sacred duty, evidence in a cosmic ledger, or the soundscape of urban grief, it tells us that our species saw something special in these drops. From the very beginning, not just biology, not just individual relief, but a force that binds homes, challenges rulers, honors the dead, and says what words can never fully convey. From medieval piety to Victorian restraint, the changing rules of who is allowed to cry this life mattered. In the next part of the story, these meanings will not remain static. As empires grow and fall, and religions succeed one another, the rules about who can cry and when will change again. From medieval monks sobbing over the wounds of Christ to Victorian gentlemen, training themselves not to flinch, the tears themselves do not change. What changes are the scripts we wrap around them. It is no longer just a family duty at the grave or a political problem for lawmakers. In certain monasteries, under stone vaults, they are treated almost like a supernatural substance. Monks and nuns speak of the donum lacrimarum, the gift of tears. If you open the writings of Gregory the Great in the 6th century, or flip through later medieval sermons and visions, you will encounter this idea again and again. Some people feel overwhelmed during prayer. Their bodies tremble. Their faces are wet. Tears flow not for a deceased relative, nor because of personal misfortune, but simply from the contemplation of God, one's sins, or the wounds of Christ. And this is not considered shameful. It is considered proof that something right has happened. The logic is as follows. Ordinary people, dulled by habit and distraction, recite the words of prayer and feel very little. But a heart truly touched by grace, a heart softened by divine love, will be pierced by compunction. This sting causes pain, but it is a sweet pain. It breaks open the hardness around the soul. This opening manifests on the body as tears. Medieval authors divide these tears into lower and higher kinds. The lower, more common ones are tears of repentance, when you are suddenly horrified by your own cruelty or pride. The higher, rarer ones are tears of longing, when you weep simply because you yearn for God and for a moment feel the distance between earth and heaven. Hagiographies, long and loving biographies of saints, are full of examples. Holy women whose veils were constantly damp from crying during mass, hermits who could not utter the name of Christ without a lump in the throat. Ignatius of Loyola, later, at the beginning of the modern era, recorded in his spiritual diary that he sobbed so often at the thought of divine mercy that a doctor began to worry about his eyesight. This is not a world where real men don't cry. This is a world where some of the most respected men cry a great deal, as long as they cry for the right reason. A knight might be expected to show self-control in battle, but a monk in his cell was almost obligated to dissolve. In this narrow space, tears were not a loss of control. They were a sign of progress, a mark that God had become especially close. But, as always, when tears gain value, suspicion follows. Some spiritual mentors warn their readers. Be careful, not every wet eye is a holy eye. One can cry from wounded pride, from fear of punishment, or even from a desire to look devout before others. Even here, concerns about pretense are already arising. By the time the medieval world transitions into what we call the Renaissance and early modern era, this suspicion gains a powerful new metaphor: the crocodile. For a long time in the Mediterranean, stories were told that crocodiles lure victims with sounds similar to a child's cry, or that they shed tears while devouring prey. Ancient naturalists repeated versions of this. It is doubtful anyone observed crocodiles long enough to be sure, but the image stuck. In the 16th century, the humanist Erasmus collected classical sayings into his adagia. Among them is to shed crocodile tears. He interprets this as feigned grief, a show of sorrow when the heart feels nothing. From there, the phrase seeps into vernacular languages. English playwrights find it irresistible. By the time Shakespeare puts words into the mouths of kings and villains, crocodile tears had become a convenient insult. Now, if a ruler weeps over a subject he has condemned, if a lover weeps with remorse after repeated infidelities, the spectator has the right to ask, are these real tears or part of a performance? The very same liquid that once proved divine grace in a chapel can now, on stage and in essays, prove hypocrisy. Notice what is happening here. Emotional tears have become so recognizable, so expected, that writers can build complex double meanings around them. At one pole is the saint in his cell, shuddering with involuntary sobs. At the other is the schemer at court, squeezing out a glistening drop at the perfect political moment. By the 18th century, this tension between sincerity and spectacle grows into a new fashion: the culture of sensibility. In enlightened Europe, especially in Britain and France, a certain ideal of the man of feeling takes hold. He is educated. He reads poetry and moral philosophy. He is attentive to the suffering of others, and, crucially, he is moved by them to tears. Sentimental novels and plays are created specifically as tear engines. Henry Mackenzie's book The Man of Feeling, published in 1771, tells of a hero whose heart is constantly moved by scenes of poverty, injustice, and tender love. Readers are expected to weep with him. Theatre audiences go to sentimental comedies not only to laugh but to sob over reunions, reconciliations, and noble sacrifices. This visible crying is not only not ridiculed but is praised. It shows that your nerves are finely tuned. Your moral sense is delicate. Tears become proof of a refined character, a sensitivity too noble to remain dry-eyed in the face of pain. This ideal is not limited to women. Men in salons and parlors can shamelessly pass handkerchiefs to one another when an especially touching scene is read aloud. A total absence of tears in such a setting might even mark you as crude, insensitive, or dangerously callous. For a brief historical moment, the rules change. Public male crying in certain cultural spaces is not a weakness, but a fashion. Then, within a few decades, these rules twist again. Throughout the 19th century, especially in Britain, as it established itself as an imperial power, a different model of masculinity began to crystallize: stiff upper lip. The phrase itself first appears in the American press in the early 1800s, but by late Victorian times, it becomes shorthand for a specific British ideal: the ability to face danger, loss, and discomfort without visible emotion. This new script does not emerge from nowhere. It draws on old Stoic philosophies and a Protestant emphasis on self-control. But it is honed by new conditions. Industrialization brings ranks of workers to factories, mines, and railroads, places where long hours and physical risk are daily realities. The ideal worker is punctual, disciplined, and reliable under pressure. Tears, like other overt displays of suffering, are viewed as something disorganizing and unproductive. At the same time, the British Empire stretches across continents. Its officers and administrators are educated in elite private schools where boys are taught, often quite brutally, not to cry. Floggings, cold baths, hazing rituals, all of this is presented as character tempering. A boy who cries is shamed. A boy who takes it like a man is praised. These boys grow up to run colonial administrations, lead regiments, and stand at the edges of maps, holding the lines that, in their minds, separate the civilized from the savages. Within this worldview, visible emotional restraint becomes part of what makes them worthy to rule. Literature and mass culture reinforce this image. By the time Rudyard Kipling writes the poem If, in 1910, If You Can Keep Your Head, when all about you are losing theirs, the figure of the imperturbable, dry-eyed gentleman has frozen as an ideal. Tears are pushed into private space, into rare bursts at funerals, into the inner rooms of the home. Again, this is not an absolute ban. Historians studying diaries and letters find plenty of Victorian men describing moments of sobbing. Rituals of public mourning for monarchs or national tragedies can still be drenched in tears, but the boundaries are now sharper. A foreman in a factory must not break down before his team. A colonel must not cry in a trench. A statesman announcing bad news may pause, feeling a lump in his throat, but he is obliged to master himself for the sake of cameras and cartoonists. War solidifies this even further. In the mass slaughter of the First and Second World Wars, soldiers who keep silent about their horror and grief are glorified. Those whose nerves give way, who sob, tremble, or dissociate, receive a diagnosis of shell shock, later combat fatigue, and often face misunderstanding or contempt. The same model persists on the home front. Women crying on the platform as trains carry sons to the front are accepted, even expected, part of the scene. Men stand behind them, with clenched jaws. We can trace a direct line from this discipline of the 19th and early 20th centuries to many norms that still hover in the background of modern Western life. The idea that boys should man up rather than cry. The suspicion that the tears of a male politician are either manipulation or a disqualifying factor. The unspoken permission that is still more easily granted to sobbing women than to men. All of this is relatively new. It is not encoded in our biology. It is the residue of factories and empires, schoolyards and barracks. And although today's psychology increasingly finds that chronic suppression of emotions can take its toll in the form of stress, cardiovascular tension, and difficulties in forming close bonds, who cries more and why? Gender, culture, and the psychology of modern tears old scripts are not so easily discarded. They are written into family histories, corporate cultures, and national myths. Thus, throughout this long arc from the monk in his cell welcoming the gift of tears, to the 18th century gentleman dabbing his eyes at a sentimental play, and the Victorian officer biting his lip until it bleeds, we see the same basic human capacity, taking vastly different forms. The tear duct does what it has always done. The nervous system flares and discharges as it always has. What changes is only the answer to the deceptively simple question, who in this place and at this time is allowed to show these drops? In the next part of the story, we look more closely at this question in the present, how gender, culture, and psychology weave together to decide who cries most often, where they cry, and what meaning is allowed to be attached to those tears. If you ask people openly and without judgment, how often do you cry? The answers fall into a pattern not perfect, not in every country, but clear enough for psychologists to plot a graph. According to large-scale surveys in dozens of countries among tens of thousands of people, women on average report crying more frequently than men. It looks like this. For many women, between 30 and 60 crying episodes a year. For many men, closer to 617. Women also speak of crying in fuller waves, with sobbing and audible weeping. Men more often describe a state where the eyes fill with moisture, and then the tears recede. Before puberty, this difference practically disappears. Little boys and little girls cry with equal frequency. The gap opens only with the onset of adolescence, which hints that biology is doing something, but not everything. If one looks at the hormonal level, several suspects appear. One is prolactin, a hormone best known for its role in breastfeeding, but also linked to stress and, curiously, found in emotional tears. By late adolescence, women on average have substantially higher levels of circulating prolactin than men. Early experiments by William Frey and others claimed that emotional tears contain more prolactin and other stress-related molecules than simple reflex tears. If this work is even partially correct, and some of it has been difficult to replicate, it offers a simplified story. More prolactin in the body may mean an easier path to tears. Anatomists have also suggested that subtle sex differences exist in the lacrimal glands themselves, and that testosterone may act as a kind of brake on tear production, while estrogen and prolactin may facilitate it. But when researchers look closer, the simple hormonal story begins to crumble. People with very high levels of prolactin, due to medical conditions, do not necessarily cry all the time. Moderate changes in hormones alone cannot predict who will cry at a given moment. Even the menstrual cycle and area, where one might expect clear, rhythmic changes, yields a hazy picture. Some women report becoming more tearful at certain points in the cycle. Others notice no difference at all. Controlled studies find trends, but not iron laws. Thus, biology sets the background. It tunes the instrument. It can make some bodies a bit more ready for tears than others, but it does not write the music. Culture does most of that. Recall those Victorian schoolyards and military academies where boys were punished for crying. Now, move that script into a modern living room. A 2-year-old boy falls, scrapes his knee, and bursts into tears. In one family, the boy is scooped up, comforted, and told, "It's okay to cry. That must have hurt a lot." In another, he hears, "Come on now. Big boys don't cry." Or, "Dust yourself off. You're fine." A girl in the same situation in many societies is, on average, more likely to be comforted rather than shamed, and her tears interpreted as understandable rather than excessive. Multiply this by thousands of small moments from playgrounds to sports teams and locker rooms, and you get a powerful learning model. Boys discover that every visible tear carries a risk of social reckoning, ridicule, punishment, or alienation. Girls discover that tears within certain limits can bring closeness, care, and permission to show vulnerability. Over time, these lessons penetrate deeper than conscious rules. They become what psychologists call display rules, that unspoken expectations about which emotions are allowed to be let out of the body and which must be kept inside. When Advinger Holtz and his colleagues compare countries, they find something revealing. The gender gap in crying is not fixed. It stretches and shrinks depending on local norms. In some wealthy, individualistic countries that pride themselves on emotional expressiveness, both men and women generally cry more, with women crying much more often than men. In countries with stricter emotional codes and starker expectations for gender roles, everyone reports crying less, and the difference between men and women there is smaller. At first glance, this might seem strange. Shouldn't greater gender equality mean a smaller gap? But what these studies capture is often not legal equality, but how acceptable it is to display emotions in public, where culture says, feel it, share it, talk about it. Women seem to accept this invitation more readily, because they have centuries of social permission behind them. Men may move a little, but they still bump into the invisible wall of the real men don't cry conviction. And there is another nuance. In many societies of Western and Northern Europe, how men cry is monitored more closely. A man who sobs at the funeral of his child is given the right to do so. A man whose breath catches at the sight of a national tragedy might even be praised for his humanity. But a man who cries openly at work, or during a minor argument, or because he feels overwhelmed, can still trigger discomfort, suspicion, and even contempt. The old scripts have softened, but they have not disappeared. However, these scripts are not universal. In other regions, the map of permitted tears looks different. For example, in some parts of the Middle East, public male crying in a religious context can still be a sign of devotion. In some Shia mourning rituals, both men and women can sob loudly for the martyrs of the past. beating their chests, and a face in tears becomes a sign of piety. In South Asian traditions, male tears in certain situations at funerals, religious festivals, public laments for shared losses are also far from taboo. A respected elder crying while reading poetry about separation from God, or grief for a deceased relative might strengthen his authority rather than undermine it. Here, the line is drawn not between men cry and women cry, but between this is a sacred or tragic time and this is ordinary life. Tears in the first zone are collectively sanctioned for everyone. Tears in the second remain more regulated. Take a step back, and you will see how the same basic dynamics we have traced through history play out in the present. Cultures decide when tears are meaningful and when they are inappropriate, whom they adorn and whom they cause to feel embarrassed. Alongside these social rules flows another stream: how tears feel from the inside. Folk wisdom offers a simple promise: have a good cry, and you'll feel better. Psychologists have tried to test this. They asked people to keep diaries of crying episodes or invited them into laboratories, showed them sad films, let the tears flow, and then tracked their moods. The results turned out to be not as straightforward as the proverb. Many people do indeed report relief after crying, but not always immediately. Sometimes the immediate consequences feel like exposure, defenselessness, and exhaustion. The mood lift, when it comes, may be delayed by minutes or hours. More importantly, whether crying helps depends heavily on the context. If you cry in a place where you feel safe, and someone responds with warmth, listens, hugs you, or just sits quietly nearby, the likelihood that you will feel better later increases. If you cry and are laughed at, ignored, or punished, the chances drop. Crying because you realized a loss is different from crying because you were just publicly humiliated. Researchers like Vingerholtz have found that when you account for these details, the reason for the cry, the presence or absence of comfort, the person's own beliefs about whether crying is shameful or acceptable, the idea of catharsis becomes not so much a universal law as a possibility. Tears can cleanse. They can also empty. The same cascade of autonomic shifts that helps the body reset in one situation simply leaves you squeezed dry like a lemon in another. This complexity becomes even clearer when looking at mental health. It would be easy to assume that frequent crying always indicates a worse state, while an absence of tears indicates strength and stability. But the clinical picture is almost the reverse. In cases of mild to moderate depression or anxiety, people often cry more. Their emotional thresholds are lower. Minor slights or sad thoughts can bring them to tears, but in more severe, prolonged depression or deep burnout, the ability to cry can actually vanish. Patients sometimes say, "I want to cry, but I can't." It feels to them as if the tears are locked behind glass. This emotional numbness, the absence of tears where you expect them, is one of the signs clinicians watch for. It can mean the nervous system is so overloaded that it has completely shut down the channels of expression. Medications can further complicate the picture. Certain antidepressants, especially those that smooth out emotional peaks and valleys, can reduce the amount of crying. For some people, this is a relief. For others, it feels like something foreign, as if a vital channel has been muffled. From this perspective, one can see how deceptive our stereotypes are. A man who rarely cries might be a stoic with good self-possession, but he might also be someone who was never allowed to feel safe enough to let his feelings go, or someone sinking into a kind of quiet, wordless despair. A woman who cries easily might be fragile, but she might also be someone whose emotional system is responsive and well integrated, and who trusts her relationships enough to show distress. By itself, the quantity of tears says very little. The story surrounding the tears, the culture, the gender script, the context, the internal landscape, all of this says much more. Therefore, when we say that women cry more than men, we are saying something true in the narrow sense of statistical averages, but incomplete in every other respect. We are measuring not just glands and hormones, but centuries of training, not just sadness, but whether sadness is permitted to take a visible form. And all of this biology, socialization, the individual psychology of each person must now navigate a completely new arena. An arena where tears can be photographed, replayed, slowed down, and turned into icons. In the next part of the story, those same old drops of salt water move onto screens and into text messages, into viral videos and into tiny yellow faces. As human beings learn to cry and represent crying in the digital age, tears in the digital age, emojis, viral videos, and the online performance of emotion, if you want to measure how strange our relationship with crying has become, you don't need to go to a funeral, a therapy session, or listen to a late-night argument. You only need to look at your keyboard. For most of the last decade, the most used emoji on Earth has been a tiny yellow face tilted back, with eyes squeezed shut and blue drops flying from both corners, the face with tears of joy. At its peak, around 2015, it accounted for about a fifth of all emojis used in some English-speaking countries. In subsequent years, according to the Unicode Consortium, the organization that standardizes these symbols, it still made up more than 5% of all emojis sent worldwide. Billions and billions of times a year, people click on a stylized version of laughing until they cry. Recently, younger users have shifted to the loudly crying face emoji or even the skull, meaning I am laughing so hard I died. But the core meaning remains. We have taken one of the most intimate, bodily, and vulnerable actions a human can perform, filling the eyes with liquid until the world blurs, and turned it into a cartoon icon that we can send dozens of times a day without a second thought. Your Paleolithic ancestors used tears as a high-stakes social signal. It was visible only at arm's length, in the firelight, on a real face that could be touched. You use them as a punctuation mark. A single law might not be enough, so you add tears. This doesn't mean our feelings have become fake, but it means the repertoire of crying has expanded. There is the wet kind that flows down cheeks, and the dry kind made of pixels and abbreviations, which performs a version of crying without any moisture at all. Then there is the crying that sits in the middle, tears you shed in front of a camera, because along with emojis, something else appeared. Platforms, places where anyone can broadcast their face and their tears to an audience, not of 20-30 kin, but of hundreds, thousands, sometimes millions of strangers. Scroll through a video feed, and you will see it. Confessional clips recorded with swollen eyes and reddened skin. Reaction videos where influencers watch heartbreaking news or touching reunions and cry on camera, along with their followers. Apology videos where a public figure's tearful statement is replayed frame by frame, in search of signs of sincerity or manipulation. On some platforms, crying on live on TikTok has become practically its own genre. People start recording in the midst of a breakup, a panic attack, or after a long day at work. They cry, they talk, they wipe their faces. Comments pour in. Comfort, criticism, accusations of attention seeking, messages from people who say they felt less alone. Sometimes these tears are genuine and impulsive. A person is overwhelmed and instinctively reaches for the nearest form of connection, which happens to be the front-facing camera. Sometimes they are clearly staged. Thumbnails for videos are chosen so that the eyes appear as glistening and red as possible. Headlines emphasize the crying as bait, and sometimes they aren't tears at all, but a simulation of tears. Augmented reality filters can now overlay a glossy, wet, trembling expression onto any face, regardless of what the person is actually feeling. One viral filter gave every user downturned eyebrows, trembling lips, and glassy, tear-filled eyes. People used it to film themselves laughing, dancing, and telling jokes. The visual language of crying, the downturned corners of the mouth, the shining eyeballs, the hint of wet tracks became a kind of mask worn for fun. Your nervous system still knows what real crying is worth. Your social world has discovered that the appearance of crying can be detached from that cost, and used, recycled, and replicated. The same has happened with animals. Earlier we spoke of the scientific debate. As far as current data shows, humans are the only species that produces tears directly linked to emotional states. Although many mammals, birds, and reptiles produce tears for eye health or salt balance, veterinarians and ethologists generally report in surveys that they do not see clear, repeatable instances of animals crying from sadness the way we do. But your video feed tells a different story. A dog sits by the door when a soldier returns from service. Its eyes noticeably glisten as it whines and presses its head against the person's chest. An elephant in a sanctuary appears to have tears running down its face when it is released from chains. A cow being led away from its calf appears to be crying on camera. These clips spread instantly. The algorithms of large platforms are tuned to notice what captures and holds attention, and little captures human attention as strongly as a familiar, powerful social signal, a crying face. The system learns. Show more of this. A single video of a crying elephant, which might once have remained a story told in one village, is now watched by tens of millions of people across different continents. It is shared with captions like "Animals cry just like us." This strengthens a belief that science still treats with great caution. Could some of these animals be experiencing complex emotions? Very likely. Could their eyes water from dust, irritation, or ordinary lubrication rather than grief? Also very likely. Without controlled observation and careful measurement, it is impossible to know the truth from a single clip. But your brain, tuned by life in a community of a species where tears almost always mean something emotional, automatically fills in the blanks. You see tracks of moisture. You see a posture that seems dejected, and the story writes itself. Thus, digital networks do not just carry our beliefs about tears, they multiply them. They replicate certain images and interpretations until they begin to seem self-evident. And this amplification does not stop at animals. This comes back to us like a boomerang. Because when tears become content, viewers begin to ask the old question with new force. Are these tears real? People slow down video recordings of public figures' apologies, trying to discern whether tears are actually falling or if the eyes are just glistening. They argue over whether crying on camera is a genuine breakdown, a calculated move to win sympathy, or an act played for clicks. There is something almost medieval in this. In past centuries, moralists and storytellers used the phrase crocodile tears to accuse someone of feigned grief. The image came from the myth that crocodiles weep while eating their prey, a bizarre combination of predation and insincere mourning. Today, this same suspicion is armed with high-definition tools, freeze frames, reaction videos, and detailed breakdowns. Was that pause too long? Did the person look into the camera? Did they stop crying as soon as they thought they were off-screen? The anxious line between genuine grief and self-serving display, drawn thousands of years ago, now shines under the harsh light of online expertise. And yet, the very fact that we study it so closely says a lot. If tears were a trifle, no one would care. There would be no point in imitating them, no reason to doubt them, no arguments in the comments about whether someone is using vulnerability as a weapon. The intensity of the reaction, sympathy, contempt, the desire to protect, rage shows that emotional tears remain one of the most powerful social signals we have. Think about what happens when you see a crying face in person. Most people feel at least a fleeting desire to comfort, to look away, to fix the situation, or to retreat. Very few remain completely indifferent. On the internet, this reflex persists, but it is filtered through layers of distance, anonymity, and performance. A video of a tearful confession can evoke sincere compassion from strangers, but it can also provoke accusations of manipulation or mockery precisely because the viewer knows on some level, cameras change behavior. A crying person is not just suffering, they are also making a choice to put that suffering on display, to frame it, to share it. In this choice lie both risk and reward. The reward is connection, recognition, sometimes money and fame. The risk is being labeled as dramatic, attention-seeking, or insincere. Seeing one's most vulnerable moments in replays and remixes, torn from the context in which they were first shared. The old rules of the village: who is allowed to cry, where, and when have not disappeared. They have simply shifted. Now, instead of a tight circle of neighbors, you stand before an invisible crowd with its own shifting norms, its thirst for authenticity and spectacle. Beneath all this emojis, filters, viral animal videos, arguments over the real and the fake, something unchanging is still at work. These salty drops still broadcast the same basic message they carried around Paleolithic campfires. I am overwhelmed. I am in need. I am not dangerous. Come closer. Or at least, please, do not hit me. Modern technology has expanded their reach and complicated their meanings, but it has not stripped them of their power. On the contrary, the way they dominate our icon sets, our feeds, and our arguments suggests the opposite. Of all the things we could choose as our favorite digital faces, we choose those that laugh until they cry, or weep so hard they flood the screen. It is as if even in text and pixels, we cannot tell a story about ourselves without turning to the moisture in our eyes. So why do we actually cry? Gathering the threads in the end. This brings us back to the central mystery of the entire journey we have taken. Why did the primate lineage develop the habit of secreting liquid from the eyes when their heart is touched? Why did these secretions become signals capable of uniting a group, splitting a community, eliciting care, provoking mockery, and now circling the planet in seconds? To answer this, we must gather together everything we have seen. The helpless infant, social glue, chemistry, rituals, gender rules, emojis. We must ask not only how tears work, but why from an evolutionary, social, and deeply human perspective they are so important. After all this biology, history, emojis, and ancient laments, you might be hoping for one clear answer. We shed emotional tears because, followed by one simple sentence tying everything in a beautiful bow. But when you ask the people who have dedicated their careers to studying this question, they do not give such an answer. They talk about a biopsychosocial phenomenon. They say it is likely many things at once. They say the data can support several overlapping stories. In other words, they say your tears refuse to sit quietly in one neat box. And that is perhaps the most fitting answer of all. Because the whole point of emotional crying is that it is messy on your face, in your chest, in your life. It blurs the boundaries between the internal and the external, between the body and society, between what is happening to you and what is happening between you and someone else. Nevertheless, if we carefully pull at all the threads we have followed, some strands come together. One powerful strand is signaling. From an evolutionary standpoint, emotional tears look like an honest social signal. They are costly. They blur your vision, make your skin flush, your throat constrict, and your breath tremble. They make you less capable of fighting, running, or controlling your facial expression. When you cry in front of someone, you literally disarm yourself. Experiments confirm this in small ways. Show people a neutral or slightly sad face on a screen, and then add digital tears to that same face. Suddenly, observers see more sadness, more need, less threat. They realize more quickly that help might be required, and are more likely, at least in hypothetical questions, to say they would offer comfort and support. This salt water doesn't just fall, it speaks. In a world of small groups and fragile alliances, this mattered. A face in tears by the campfire was a way to broadcast, I am overwhelmed. I am not dangerous. I need you. Think of conflict within a group. Grudges, arguments over resources. A defiant gaze maintains tension. A tearful gaze, especially combined with a softened voice, can shift the script from confrontation to reconciliation. In this sense, tears are like a white flag you wave with your own body. Thus, one answer to why we cry is that evolution discovered that secreting water from the eyes is an effective way to modulate the behavior of others, reduce aggression, attract caregivers, and mark certain moments as serious, sacred, or requiring attention. The second powerful strand is attachment. In all mammals, the young are noisy. When separated from caregivers, they call, peep, and scream. These cries act on the nervous system of adults, forcing them to come and comfort. Human infants do the same. But somewhere in our ancestry, it seems something else was added. Visible, glistening tears. Why? One idea is that, as our ancestors became more visually oriented and prone to long-term bonds, a visible signal layered on top of the sound became particularly useful. A helpless infant with a wet face, a grieving parent with a wet face, a partner begging not to be abandoned with eyes full of tears. These are not just general displays of distress. They are magnetic fields for attention. When studying crying in real life, you see how closely it is woven into relationships. People report crying most often not in total solitude, but in connection with others. Arguments, reconciliations, funerals, breakups, weddings, reunions. And when crying leads to comfort, a hand on the shoulder, a kind word, or simply someone staying nearby, it is more likely to be remembered later as relieving or even healing. This aligns with what we know about chemistry, though this part of the story is still being written. Emotional tears, when analyzed, contain different mixtures of proteins and stress-related substances than simple onion tears. Prolactin, ACTH, and certain endorphin-like molecules appear at higher levels, at least in some studies. People often report feeling calmer after a good cry, as if something has shifted, not only in the room, but inside the body. No one can yet say for sure how much of this change is biochemical detox, and how much is the social response, the hug, the listening, the easing of pressure. Most likely, it is both. Your lacrimal glands, hormones, vagus nerve, amygdala, and the people sitting next to you are all parts of one big feedback loop, which brings us to the third strand, self-regulation. Even if the old claim that we cry out toxins turns out to be exaggerated, there is strong evidence that crying is one way your nervous system tries to reset. You feel tension building, emotions rising, and everything you've tried to hold back threatens to overflow. Then, at some point, it happens. The breathing becomes uneven. The eyes fill with moisture. The muscles go limp. After this, in the right context, a kind of relaxation can set in. The parasympathetic system, the branch of your physiology responsible for rest and digestion, seems to kick back in. You may feel hollowed out, tired, but also with a little more space inside your chest. So, to summarize, we might say, humans shed emotional tears because over hundreds of thousands of years, these tears became a multi-tool, a way to send honest signals, a way to strengthen fragile attachments, and quite possibly, a way to help the body endure and restore balance in moments of intense states. These are not three separate functions, but three sides of the same shimmering drop, and beneath all three lies the same foundation. We are a deeply, almost absurdly social species. Your ancestors survived not because they were the strongest solitary hunters. They survived because they formed groups, shared food, exchanged knowledge, helped with others' children, and painfully learned to live alongside one another without tearing each other apart. In this world, any adaptation that helped communicate need, reduce violence, increase trust, and stabilize relationships would be encouraged again and again. From this perspective, emotional tears are not a curious side effect. They are one of the most vivid signatures of who we are. Highly social primates whose survival depended on the ability to read each other's faces with exceptional accuracy and to allow their own to be read. As for the claim of uniqueness that began this story, as far as scientists can currently tell, no other species produces tears regularly and specifically in response to emotions the way we do. When veterinarians and field biologists search, they find many tears for eye health, flushing out irritants, or managing salt balance. They hear distress calls and see postures of grief or fear, but they do not repeatedly see what a human would call sobbing. And yet, the more closely we look at other animals, the less comfortable this absolute line becomes. Dogs, for example, share our homes and daily lives. In one recent study, when dogs were reunited with their owners after a separation, the volume of their tears increased. Oxytocin, the attachment hormone that also fills human systems during hugs, nursing, and close contact, was apparently involved. Does this mean dogs cry tears of joy like we do? Not necessarily. The sample was small, the mechanism unclear, the behavior subtle. Most experts are cautious. Nevertheless, it hints that the building blocks of emotional crying, oxytocin, the lacrimal gland, social bonds, are not uniquely human. What seems unique is how we assembled them. We took the same general mammalian toolkit, attachment hormones, vocal cries, moist eyes, and, in the specific pressure cooker of human evolution, turned it into a highly visible, morally charged, culturally prescribed performance. Your tears are not just moisture, they are meaning. And this meaning has layered upon them through millennia of history. Ancient mourners in Mesopotamia scratched their faces and dropped tears as an offering to the dead. Greek tragedians made audiences cry intentionally, believing it cleansed the soul. Medieval mystics cried as proof of sincerity. Victorian men learned to restrain tears in public, while women were told that crying made them simultaneously suspicious and sensitive. Today, a few pixels in the shape of drops can replace real salt water. And the question, are these real tears, can dominate news headlines. Beneath all these changes, the same signal continues to shimmer. I am moved. Something in me is too big for words alone. Therefore, when you feel your eyes begin to sting and your vision start to blur, you are not just experiencing a private glitch. You are participating in something very ancient. You are echoing the helpless infant whose wet face attracted a caregiver tens of thousands of years ago. You are echoing the hunter who returned empty-handed and could not put into words his fear for the group's survival, but whose eyes gave him away. You are echoing the women who stood at Bronze Age graves, lamenting and weeping together so loudly that the very sound became a bridge between the living and the dead. You are echoing, though you may never meet a person thousands of miles away who is crying today, for reasons completely different from yours. And yet, in the architecture of the face, the tear duct, and the nervous system, it is exactly the same. If you zoom out far enough, every tear that has ever fallen belongs to one story, the story of a fragile, intelligent primate trying to live with others and with itself. There is no single reason for these drops, no final equation that will explain everything. There is only this: a species that survived thanks to trust and cooperation, which created languages, rituals, laws, and platforms, which painted the walls of caves and encoded emojis, and which, in the strangest and most intense moments of its existence, still allows water to fall from its eyes. So, if before sleep you remember a time when you cried and felt shame, weakness, or awkwardness, you can treat that memory a little more gently. You were doing what your body learned long before the appearance of cities, screens, or clocks. You were sending a signal forged in the long darkness of our evolutionary nights. You were proving, in the simplest, saltiest way possible, that you belong to this human story. And now the story can rest a little. You have followed this thread all the way from microscopic proteins in a drop of salt water, through Paleolithic campfires and medieval chapels to the glow of your own screen today. If you are still awake and your mind feels a little fuller, or perhaps a little softer, and you would like more such journeys, it will greatly help the algorithm if you make yourself known. A quiet like, a short comment, a subscription if you haven't done so yet. These are small modern signals that tell this channel to continue creating long, strange bedtime stories about what it means to be human. If you want to share, you can also tell me from which part of the world you are listening, and if anything in this story surprised you. Was it the idea that, as far as we know, no other animal cries emotional tears the way we do? The thought that a good cry might be your nervous system's attempt to bring itself back into balance. The realization that your own tears are part of a story older than writing. These little notes from different places, cities, villages, bedrooms, night shifts become a kind of map. A constellation of people lying in the darkness, each with their own life, listening to the same human story. And if you want to support this story a bit more directly, there is an opportunity to become a sponsor of the channel. This helps me find the time and resources for research, writing, and recording episodes like this. This is possible if you wish, and absolutely fine if not. Simply the fact that you are here and listening is already a kind of support. Before we finish, there is one last thought I want to leave with you before sleep. Somewhere along life's path, many of us learn to treat tears as a small failure, as a crack in the dam that we must keep perfectly sealed. But everything we have just gone through, biology, archaeology, the cultural acrobatics of rules, points in the opposite direction. Crying is not the opposite of strength. It is one of the ways the human body bears what it cannot yet explain. It is one of the ways the human face asks for help without needing the right sentence. It is one of the clearest signs that you are built for connection, not for isolation. In the language of self-compassion, this is sometimes called common humanity, the recognition that pain and struggle are not personal glitches, but shared features of being a living creature. Every time your eyes fill, this truth is right there, shimmering on the surface. So, if tears come to you today, or some other night, you don't need to argue with them. You don't need to justify them to anyone, including yourself. You can simply notice, and this, too, is something my species learned in order to survive. This, too, is human, and with that thought of all the people through time whose faces glisten exactly like yours, you can allow your body to become heavy, your breathing to slow, and your mind to loosen its grip. Good night. May your sleep be deep, your dreams kind, and may your tears, when they visit you, come exactly when they should come, and leave you softer than they found you. Thank you.